Through 1984 and 1987, a serial killer rampaged through Stockholm's red light district, slaying young sex workers, mutilating their corpses, and harvesting their organs. Like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell for weekly chilling crime content. A forensic pathologist assigned to one of the victims said of the killer, "It's obvious this man has a scalpel and knows how to use it. He knows precisely where all the internal organs are. The person who did this must have medical training." The pathologist knew this because he himself had a dark secret. He'd been intimate with these sex workers in more ways than one. The story of Dr. Teet Harum remains one of the most perplexing and disturbing cases in Swedish history. The victim that started it all. On July 18, 1984, a dog walker made a shocking discovery beneath Karlberg Bridge in central Stockholm. The dog began barking and pulling at two trash bags below a tree, and when the man inspected the contents out of curiosity, he found a woman's torso in one, two severed legs in the other. The man called the police, who were unequipped to deal with the sheer brutality on display. Whoever this victim was had not only been decapitated and dismembered limb by limb, but her killer had also extracted her internal organs. It wasn't until a month later, on August 7th, that two more bags were discovered near the Karolinska Medical University, these containing the same victim's hands and arms. Police called upon the expertise of Dr. Teet Harum, an esteemed criminal pathologist and a noted expert in the field of killing methods utilized by sexual psychopaths. Harum was revered in his profession and had even been cited in high-profile medical journals the world over. Stockholm authorities regularly used his services in murder investigations. Harum was able to reconstruct the body, despite missing her head and left breast. He managed to identify the victim as Katrine de Costa, a 27-year-old sex worker and heroin addict from the local area. More victims surface. By the time Harum had identified the first victim, the second was already on his operating table. On August 1st, the body of Annika Moors, another mid-20s sex worker, was found dead in a public park, having been raped, strangled, and mutilated in the same manner as the first victim. Less than a week later, a third body, belonging to 27-year-old sex worker Christine Kravash, was found naked and strangled in Stockholm's red light district. Harum determined that all three victims were the work of the same perpetrator. One by one, more local sex workers began to disappear in just a few short weeks. Lena Grans, Katz Falk, Lena Befors, Lena Manson, and Lotta Svensson all vanished without a trace. Not only did police determine that they were dealing with a serial killer, but the rapid pace of the killing suggested that this perpetrator had an unquenchable thirst for blood and wouldn't cease anytime soon. In just 2 months, this faceless monster had claimed a total of 8 victims. One of the missing women, Lena Befors, had previously told fellow workers that she knew exactly who this phantom killer was, but she couldn't tell authorities because the killer apparently worked for the police. Before Lena could say any more, she promptly vanished. A strange phone call. In the fall of 1984, police received a phone call from an elderly gentleman. The man claimed that 2 years earlier, his daughter had died from an apparent suicide. Like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell for weekly chilling crime content. Let us know in the comments who'd you like us to cover next. But he believed that she'd actually been murdered. Her killer, the man said, was his son-in-law. He claimed that his daughter had been murdered by her own husband, and he had reason to believe that the same man was responsible for the string of prostitute killings in that area too. The suspect the man was referring to was a 28-year-old pathologist who worked at the Karolinska Medical University, a man the police were already familiar with because they'd worked closely with him on this very case. The man's name was Teet Harum. Harum's sinister past. When police looked into Harem's history, they made some disturbing discoveries. According to local sex workers, Harem frequently enlisted their services and was seen on one occasion violently assaulting one. Harem would often invite his friends to view postmortems and send people unsolicited pictures of his autopsy work. In his office, he kept a number of skulls and brains belonging to the victims of Stockholm's newest ripper. Most concerning of all was that of Harem's wife. In 1982, 2 years before the murders began, Harem had reportedly found his wife hanging from a side of the bed in what authorities later deemed a suicide. However, Harem's wife had been dressed for a night out, and Harem's response to her death was cold detachment. 2 months after his wife's death, Harem submitted a medical paper to an American science journal. The subject matter was neck injuries as a result of hanging. Local sex workers had also spotted a white Volkswagen patrolling the area in recent months, and one eagle-eyed woman had the insight to note down the license plate. When the police checked it, they found it belonged to the good doctor. So in late 1984, Harem was arrested and brought in for questioning. A search of Harem's house uncovered some strange findings. In his bedroom, they found a knife in a leather sheath and a picture of his wife's dead body on the autopsy table. Harem claimed that the picture had been sent to him by a friend and denied killing neither his wife nor the 8 sex workers. Despite a mound of circumstantial evidence, police didn't have enough to keep Harem detained, so after 5 days of interrogation, he was let go. After Harem was arrested, news of his possible involvement in the murders reached the mainstream press. Harem was forced to leave his job as a pathologist and even attempted suicide given his newfound infamy. Harem survived the attempt, but it left him almost completely deaf, an unlikely eyewitness. At the time of Harem's arrest, there was another, completely unrelated case going on. Police were investigating accusations against a Dr. Thomas Algen, another bright young medical professional with a promising future. According to Algen's estranged wife Christina, her former husband had sexually assaulted their 5-year-old daughter. Bizarrely, Algen and Harem had been co-workers at a Stockholm hospital in the early 80s. Algen's wife had recognized Harem in the news reports because on one occasion, Algen had invited Harem to their place for dinner. Christina had taken an instant dislike to Harem because of his creepy demeanor, and Christina claimed to police that she had hard evidence that Harem and her ex-husband were responsible for the recent killings. But the evidence didn't come from Christina. It came from her 5-year-old daughter. In one of the most unlikely eyewitness accounts in history, Algen's young daughter said that she'd watched her father and Harem dissect the corpse of the Katrin da Costa, the first victim, in an autopsy room. The 5-year-old claimed that the 2 men had been wearing nothing but pointy hats and had drank Costa's blood, eaten her flesh, and drilled into her skull. All of this information came not only from a 5-year-old, but at the time it happened, she was only 18 months old. A child psychologist and psychiatrist were called in to assess the daughter's claims for legitimacy. Both of them believed that she was telling the truth. Police then zoned in on the 2 doctors, arresting them and charging them both with the murder of Katrin da Costa. To their shock, Algen confessed to everything. He admitted his involvement in Katrin da Costa's murder and told investigators that Harem was his high priest, and the 2 doctors would lure prostitutes to the morgue and practice cannibalism, necrophilia, and blood drinking by night. It seemed that police had everything they needed to convict these 2 men. However, things went on to become stranger still. Mounting evidence and trial. News of the 2 murderous doctors swept the media into a frenzy. The image of 2 bright young medical workers dissecting a woman in an autopsy room was something straight out of a horror film, so newspapers were quick to assign them sensationalist labels. Following news of the doctors' arrests, more accusations came forward. A local camera shop owner claimed that Algen had dropped off a film to be developed, pictures that showed a mutilated body. Another witness, a friend of the first victim who was in possession of the victim's diary, showed police an entry describing sadistic sexual encounters with 2 men and a little girl in what she termed a death room. It was enough to put the 2 doctors in front of a judge. However, there was one major problem. The hardest piece of evidence was the testimony of a girl who was only 18 months old at the time she witnessed this so-called murder. The tape of her confession was played in court, with the 5-year-old saying, "They threw the head away, and then the lady was chopped up." Defense attorneys rightfully questioned the credibility of this eyewitness account, despite the admissions of the child psychologist that the daughter's claim were legitimate. Furthermore, the cause of death for Katrine da Costa could not be determined, since many of her vital organs were still missing. Harum maintained his innocence, claiming that the press were using him as a scapegoat to clear unsolved murders off the books. Algin claimed he was an unwilling accomplice in Harum's murderous games, telling judges that Harum was on a vengeful mission to rid the streets of sex workers. According to Algin, Harum was the leader of a secret medical society of human vampires, but refused to elaborate further. Despite these so-called confessions, neither Harum nor Algin could be sentenced for any of the recent murderers, even that of Katrine da Costa, due to a lack of physical evidence. They could be found guilty of desecrating a corpse. However, since 4 years had elapsed since the time it took place, they'd passed the statute of limitations for the crime. Therefore, Tiit Harum and Thomas Algin were both found not guilty. The full story. It's an alluring, sensationalist story. Two deranged doctors foregoing their medical oaths and committing atrocities in the sanctuary of a morgue. However, hindsight has allowed us to see that Harum and Algin may not have been homicidal monsters after all. Algin's daughter's claims are now thought to be fabricated, implanted in her head by her mother and the psychologist assigned to her. Furthermore, a lot of the imagery she described, such as characters in pointy hats drilling into things, were transposed from a book she had about elves. Algin had recently been cleared of molestation charges at the time his wife contacted the police, so this may have been her way of exacting vengeance. The camera shop owner could not prove his claims of someone bringing in pictures of a dissected body. Furthermore, he could not identify Algin from a police lineup. Exactly why Algin invented a clearly fictitious backstory about a vampire cult remains a mystery. Today, both Tiit Harum and Thomas Algin live free lives. Like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell for weekly chilling crime content. Let us know in the comments who'd you like us to cover next.